Okay, this is Julie Heupel, and I'm interviewing my brother-in-law, Doug Smith, who had an interesting job during his summers while he was in college. What years would that have been?
So I worked as a railroad relief agent in the depots in the summer of 1969, 70, 71, and 1972.
And what was the railroad company?
I worked for the Chicago Great Western, which had absorbed the I worked for the Chicago Northwestern, who has absorbed the Chicago Great Western several years earlier.
Okay, and what kind of duties does a relief agent do?
So by 1969, there was no longer any passenger rail on the Chicago Great Western. So that job no longer existed for the depot agent like it had for my grandfather when he was the agent in Dunkerton.
And who was your grandfather?
My grandfather was Thomas Nye, and he was the agent in Dunkerton for many, many, many years. But I'm not sure what year he actually retired. So.
And he was also the telegraph operator
He was
then?
the telegraph operator. He did all the ticket sales, as well as all of the depot agent other activities. So the job entailed two different parts. One was to work with all the local merchants who either had rail stuff coming in or requesting empty railroad cars to load and to ship out. And as part of that job, I would have to do the bill of ladings, which told the train operators, particularly the conductor, and the brakeman, which cars to pick up, where to put them in line on the train so they knew where they were going. And it also included calculating all of the freight charges on that part. The other part of the job was dealing with the railroad trains itself, and you would receive orders from the train dispatchers, and as part of that job, it was my job to relay all of the train orders to the train itself. And to do that, because there wasn't computers at the time or any technology, you had to write out the message, repeat it back to the dispatcher who kept track of where every train was, and then you had to put it on a Y stick with a string, and you had to stand 3 feet from the edge of the track, and the train, I assume it was the assistant operator, would come in and he would reach out with an arm and stick it through that Y and scoop the message off the stick. And you didn't want to be leaning away when he reached out, because if he missed it, they had to stop the train, and they didn't really like that. It cost a whole lot of money to stop and restart the train once it was rolling.
So you kept a hold of the stick, and you kept the Y stick, and as he reached his arm in,
it was in a clip with the and then his arm would come in and he would catch the string, which was a circle, a loop, and it was attached to a clip at the bottom, and then he would just pull it out of the clip, and then they would take the message and keep on rolling down the tracks. He also had to work with exchanging railroad crews because they weren't allowed to work more than 10 hours because of union rules. You worked with all of the gentlemen who section crews who had to repair the tracks or keep maintenance on the tracks. My job was that I did all of those activities at different depots for whoever was on a vacation. And that could go from anywhere from as far north as Stillwater, Minnesota, that was just outside of Minneapolis, to as far east as St. Charles, Illinois, which was just outside of Chicago, all the way to St. Joseph, Missouri, just short of Kansas City, or out to Spencer, Iowa, which was just short of Sioux City. So I went anywhere within that district for whatever length of time each person's vacation was.
And how did you get there? Did you ride the train or get there some other way?
No, I was not allowed to ride the train because there was no longer passenger service technically. So I had to drive my own car, and in 1969 they used to pay 7 cents a mile, which sounds ludicrous today, but in 1969 that was great because gas was only like 27 cents a gallon.
So, and what kind of pay were you getting for this?
I was getting the same pay that each of the railroad operators were getting. And in 1969, I believe, you could probably double check, but I would say the minimum wage was somewhere around $1 a quarter, $1.75, and I was making anywhere from $11 to $13 or $14 an hour. I was receiving the same pay as the man who normally, or lady, in those days it was always men, sorry ladies, but so I got the same pay as they got because it was all unionized activities. In the depots at that time, they still had telegraphy. The telegraph still worked. They had their own private phone lines that were maintained by railroad linesmen, and we also had public telephones. And why we had to have all three is beyond me, except I believe it had to do with the unions having enough influence to keep those jobs active.
Now you said you didn't actually run the telegraph, but there were men still using the telegraph.
So at that time, the telegraph was not the primary communication tool. It was the railroad maintained telephone lines, but there were older gentlemen who still had their jobs who would communicate back and forth with each other using the telegraph, and who knows what they were saying about the rest of us because none of us knew how to use it. But most of these men learned that skill probably either from World War I or World War II.
And they were communicating in Morse code.
Right. They used Morse code on the telegraph. And my grandfather had learned it when he got joined the Navy during World War I. He got sent to Harvard University for 6 months, and he took a crash course in telegraphy, and then he was assigned to 2 or 3 different ships that spent their time over off the coast of France and Spain during World War I.
And then he came home
and because he had the skill of being a telegrapher, the railroad hired him because that was the only means of communication shortly after World War I, around 1919, 1920s. We didn't have phones or anything in the rural parts of the country yet.
So which depots would he have worked in? Number 2, obviously, because we have a picture of him with the burned out telephone pole. So he probably hadn't started when the first one burned down.
What year was that?
1914, I think?
No, because he would have been in the military during that time. So he would have worked in Dunkerton Depot number 2 and Dunkerton Depot number 3.
Okay.
Correct.
You were talking last night, the different billing based on whether it was raw goods or finished product.
So if you had raw goods come in, such as a train carload of wheat, that would be one billing rate. And we had an example of where in St. Charles, Illinois, that would be sent to General Mills or Betty Crocker or whoever's were doing that, and they would make it into cake mixes, box it all up, and those products were then loaded back onto pallets, loaded back onto train cars, and shipped out all over the country, where today all that kind of stuff would leave those plants in semis. But the billing rates were different for each ones, and there were times that there was so much going in and out of the railroad that in 1970 or 71, all of the companies would remit the funds that they were charged to the depot agent, and the depot agent then would remit it as agent remitted to a bank that honored the railroad. And for me, it was kind of almost scary, because there were times that I would handle checks worth $300,000 and $1 million worth of checks in a week. And in 1970, $1 million then would be, I don't know how many multi-million dollars today, but they allowed a young college kid to do that kind of crazy stuff. So that was scary, actually.
Yeah, I would imagine.
It's like, 300,000, I would never have to work another day in my life, you know? They trusted a young kid like that back in those days. So that was kind of, you know, it made you feel good that they trusted you.
Yeah.
You know, so, and then one of those times, just to tell you how times were different, my wife's brother and my brother rode along with me to go to the depot in St. Charles, Illinois.
And tell me the people.
And Larry Smith and Rob Heipel, they came along for the week just to hang out and do stuff. And the guys operating the train, the engineer and the conductor, said, "Hey, you guys want to ride to Chicago and back?" And of course they both said, "Yeah." So they loaded both those young guys up into the engine of the train and drove them to Chicago. And I didn't know the name of the people running the train, and if either one of their mothers would have ever found out that they did that, or I let them do that, all three of us would have been dead probably. The two of them went off on the train into Chicago, and later they came back on the train. So,
And how old were they? Junior high?
well, how much younger are they than I am?
75, graduated.
So
6
6 years
years.
younger, and I would have been 20,
So junior high,
so
probably.
14, yeah,
Yeah.
14, 13, 14, 15 they were. Times were different then.
Mhm.
Today that would never happen, let alone let them on the train.
So they actually rode in the engine with the
In the engine
engineer.
with the engineers. They may have gotten to blow the whistle or drive the, or whatever
probably.
driving the train that consists of. They only had a pedal for gas, which was really electric, because they're diesel electrics, and then they had a speed control and a brake pedal, and that was all they had. I mean, there's no steering wheel in a train. The tracks tell you where you're going.
So what kind of engines were these? These wouldn't be the big black locomotive steam engines that we think
No,
of.
they weren't the steam engines.
Okay.
They were the first generation train after that. They weren't the same ones that we have today. I would have to look that up, but they all were a certain specific type of engine that the railroads used back in the day. Like I said, I don't know, but it was all diesel electric trains.
Okay.
So there were diesel engines that created electric power, and then the electricity is what actually drove the trains. So, and that is still how trains run today, unless they're tied to wires, and then they don't have a diesel engine because they're pulling the electricity off the wires that they're connected to.
Like some city trains,
Right.
I like that.
Well, or Europe, most of Europe's are that way. They have the arms that run up overhead.
So did they still have a caboose?
In those
They had
days,
a
they all
caboose.
had cabooses, and they had four-man crews. So they had the engineer, the brakeman, the fireman, and the conductor. So they still have a four-person crew on every train in those days. And then eventually, they eliminated some of the jobs, but not while I was working, up through 72. But they would eventually then eliminate the caboose and just put the red light on the back, which what's on the trains today. And
So when they would pick up cars, how did they know where they were to go? you said they had a number?
Every
On
train,
every
car
car.
has its own individual marking, and the conductor on the train had a bill of lading, which was a slip of paper in those days, that had that number on it, and what company it was to go to, and what city, and they knew where to then take them, or if I were to give them a handful of bill of ladings, they would have to go into the siding along the co-op or whatever, find the 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 cars that were ready to leave, and they would have to come in with the engine, pick them up, run them back on the main line, and hook them into the train so that they could continue to go.
So when they were dropping off cars, they weren't necessarily in the right order. You might have picked up several in between, so it might be in the middle of the train.
Right.
So you'd have to go to a siding.
And well,
Uh-huh.
so then to reorder, well, yeah, so they just pick them up and put them in line. And then when they would go to a main yard, they called it a railroad yard, which in our case was Owine, Marshalltown, St. Joe, Missouri, and then I'm not sure, I assume there's one up in Minneapolis, but I've never gotten to that one. They would offload them onto separate sidings. There might be 10 or 12 siding tracks, and if they were going to Chicago, they'd go on this track. If they were going to Kansas City, they'd go on a different track.
So, and another train might pick them up from
Right,
there,
then
right?
they'd get built into a new train, leaving from that primary location, and then heading down to a different site. So that was the first time during that period of time that they started making an entire train out of the same cars. So like today you might drive down the highway and see a train that's 100 cars that are identical, that are all hauling coal or hauling some other commodity. And that started during that time. Up until then, all the trains just had a conglomeration of whatever was going from A to B to C. And the other thing is that there were hazardous waste carried on trains back in those days. No one knew about it, sort of like the accident that just happened in Ohio. And they had the big fire and all the chemicals, and the people had to evacuate the towns. But back in those days, they actually even carried nuclear materials in train cars. And they didn't tell anybody because they didn't want anybody trying to sabotage the train
Right.
or steal whatever was in one of those cars. But you knew it as a depot or a railroad person because every one of those trains had a vehicle in the front making sure the tracks were all good out ahead of the train. So they were preceded by something and then usually followed up by another type of a small railroad vehicle like the pickup trucks that they run on the rails.
So where was that headed? Out west somewhere, or you don't know?
I didn't get to know either. I just know when they were going by, you know, and all trains tracks do have a speed limit, and that varies from location to location. There were rules about every time you crossed an intersection, the horn had to be honked X number of times. So all of you that got irritated by that, it was mandatory by law. And some cities now have exemptions to those laws because they have the right kind of railroad crossing signs or symbols or arms that allows them not to have them honked at every intersection in a city.
So going back to the sidings, what did Dunkerton have, or maybe it still has? Did it have a siding where
Yeah,
cars could be
Dunkerton-
switched?
Right.
Okay.
So we had our own siding, but we would actually get lumber in for the Dunkerton Lumberyard. We would get cement powder in for Shimp Cement Company. And We got lots and lots of grain cars for the Dunkerton elevator. So those were the three main companies that would get stuff shipped in by rail. It was all bulk type commodities or shipped out in case of grain from the Dunkerton elevators.
So the creamery probably wasn't running at that time, because we found some documents that said they were shipping to New York from the
Really?
Dunkerton Creamery, yeah.
It was not shipping when I was working there, and I only worked in the 4 summers. I only worked at the Dunkerton Depot for one stint for 3 weeks, and that happened to be in that first summer of 1969. And we did not ship anything from the creamery that I know of.
So was that what you were filling in for Tom? Tom Nye?
No, Pete already retired. Actually,
Oh.
he passed away by then.
Okay.
So and it's funny, and I probably shouldn't tell everybody, but since all the depots are gone, every depot had the same lock key to it. And so they would issue me a lock key, and I could access any depot on the whole entire railroad system between those 4 major points of Kansas City, Minneapolis, Sioux City, Omaha, or Chicago. And so
That's a lot of trust for
again,
a college kid.
yeah, for anybody that, I mean, the only thing they knew about me when they let me have a job was that my grandfather had worked for the railroad, and my grandma, who knew the dispatcher that I worked for, vouched for me. And so I got to do that for 4 summers, and it was the most fabulous summer job when you're going to college that you could ever ask for. So
Very cool.
what
Kenny,
else?
did you have a question?
No,
Yeah,
the
question,
questions I wanted to ask you,
Oh,
he either said or.
okay.
What else do you?
So you told a story last night about somebody not following the speed limit in the train.
Yeah.
Tell that story.
So, I was working in Conception Junction, Missouri, which is north of St. Joe, down near Savannah, Missouri, and at that location, we had our trains ran north and south, and another company's train ran on a trestle over the top of ours, east and west. And one of our trains came down through there, and someone on the train evidently thought he needed to get home very, very quickly, because they ran the route from Des Moines to Kansas City, where when you calculate the distance and the time it took, about 50 to 70% over whatever the posted speed limit was. So if the speed limit was 40, they were doing like 60. And if anyone's ever ridden on a train, trains go clickety-clack, and that clickety-clack has bouncing going with it and swaying back and forth. And as this train came under the trestle in Savannah, or in Conception Junction, there was several automobile carrier cars, and the cars on the top row were hitting the trestle up above and popping the windshields out of these brand new cars. So when something like that happens, then the railroad gets very serious and investigated, and of course these gentlemen got some time off without pay.
They didn't get fired?
No, they didn't get fired because the union wouldn't let them. So, there were so many things. And the railroad back then did have its own railroad police who would investigate missing equipment. This was another episode that happened down in Missouri where 4 combines that were being shipped on flat cars disappeared. and the investigators from the railroad were looking for it, and so they had to come into every depot and see if you had history on that car. Did you have that number? Did you say it was in one of your sightings? So as part of as a depot agent, your responsibility was to track every car that was sitting on a siding that was in your responsible area. So it might be 2 or 3 towns in the time. If it's a big city, it was just one, but you were responsible to know what cars were there, how long they'd been there, to charge fees if they held the cars for excessive length of time, either unloading or loading. But so they would come looking for those cars and see if you knew anything about it. And fortunately, whenever it happened, I wasn't assigned to that station when the events occurred. So, that was a good thing.
So you don't know if they ever found the combines?
I don't ever know. No, 4 combines.
4 combines.
4 combines.
That's kind of hard to lose.
Yeah. Well, you would think, but you drive down highways across the United States today, and there's lots of rows and rows of railroad cars that sit out on sidings out in the country that aren't being used. And my political advertisement would be that back in 1970, you could load 7 semi-loads of grain into one railroad car. And if we're really, really, really worried about the carbon dioxide and the exhaust from all our vehicles, it would be very wise to start going back and hauling much more freight on trains, because it only takes 4 train engines to haul 100 cars of grain, and that would be 700 semi-loads in one train. So
that's pretty amazing.
Yeah, and that was in those days. Mm-hmm. The engines are bigger and more powerful. The cars they haul them in are bigger, so it probably would equate to much more than that today even.
So totally different subject here with the trains, but did you ever see hobos? Did you ever have people riding the rails?
Did I ever see
Did you ever
hobos?
notice?
No. I think they would if they were hobos, they were in empty boxcars, always had the doors left open.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe, some of that may have been intentional. I can't say for a fact, but if it was, the hobos were inside of the boxcars and out of the view when they went by a depot.
Mm-hmm.
But part of your job too was, as every train went by, you were to inspect the train and make sure what they didn't have were any hot boxes. And a hot box was where the wheel bearings would be going out on one of the axles, and it would start smoking, just like when the brakes go bad on a vehicle, particularly in the mountains. They'll get hot and they'll start even on fire. And your job was to let the conductor at the end of the train know it, because that was the only way you could do it, because there was no radio that worked.
So you were inspecting as they were going by?
Yes, you were inspecting the train, looking for hot axles. So so you had to be outdoors and inspect every train that went by that you were working at.
So were there certain hours that they didn't run? Like, did they run through the night?
Yes, they would run all night too. Now, if you weren't assigned to work, then you didn't have to inspect them. But if you were on duty, then you had to inspect every train. But the trains ran 24/7, and the train crews could only work 10 hours. And so no matter where they were at 10 hours, the train stopped. And then they would have to get a new crew to come out and take their place. And usually you had a taxi or something, or somebody that was a employee of the railroad or a contractor for the railroad, and they would haul them, the new crew out, take the old crew to a hotel and put them up for the night. And that still happens today. If you get on a major rail line like along I-80 in you watch that through Nebraska, there'll be trains sitting still out in the country, and that's because the train crew's time limit had expired. They're 10 hours, and so they'd have to stop wherever they were at.
They do that with buses too, because Rob had to do that when he drove bus.
Is that right?
Yeah.
They had limits like, so yeah,
And they bring in.
right, and I don't know that was a union rule, that may have been a federal Federal Transportation Commission rules and
Yeah.
stuff like that, but yeah, so it was a very active job, and usually I would go from town to town to town, and I would be told on a Thursday or a Friday, oh, on Monday you need to be at this depot in this town, and you just kind of had to find it because they never gave you an address. You couldn't punch it in your computer on your car, so you just had to go find it and find where the depot was, and you knew you had a key because they were all keyed the same, like I said earlier.
So did you just stay at the depot? You didn't, you had to be there 24 hours a day, right?
No, you didn't have to be
Oh,
there 24 hours
okay.
a day, no. So you just had to be
It's
there.
a cheap hotel.
You know, yeah, so I also got a stipend back in the day, and that was $7 a day, which doesn't sound like very much, but this was 1970 or 69, 71, and if you could find a little stay-by-the-week hotel and told them you didn't need your sheets cleaned every night, you could get by really cheap. Or if you had a nice depot that actually had running water in it, then you could have, were okay with you staying in the hotel, or the hotel, in the depot if you really wanted to. So I always took stuff so I could stay if I didn't know what it was going to be like, just in case, because I wanted to save money, because I was a kid and
In college.
and so
So were you at a depot when there was a train derailment?
yes.
Okay. What happened?
So there was a train on the main tracks going south, and there was a train that was supposed to be on the siding going north. But the train going north ran through the switch at the far end of the siding, meaning that it was trying to go back onto the main track, but the switch was still closed, so it derailed the train, but it was in the way of the train going the opposite direction. So there were two trains nose to nose, and it was on a Sunday night, and it was raining and lightning, and I just happened to get there because I wasn't assigned to be there at that time of day, but I was just getting in on a Sunday night, and we had to get the crew to come in and fix the tracks after they got the train back on the tracks.
How do you do that? Was it
A
crane?
lot of jacks and stuff in those days. They didn't really have cranes that could pick up a train that was way too heavy. And then they'd once they get it back on, luckily they'd gone through the switch, so it wasn't like derailed and off the tracks by, it was just like your slot car when it comes off the track type thing. So, but they have to fix that, and then of course get them back on the siding, get the main line all fixed up before the train can go. And so was one of those times that I worked from 11 at night to 5 o'clock the next day. And because I did that, and because I was covered under the railroad union, the union people would come take care of me and tell me how to fill out my time card, because I had filled it out that I had worked from 12, 18 hours, 20 hours. And they said, oh, you can't do that. You can't work more than 10. So even then, they would say, okay, you came in for 10 minutes. And it's like, no, I didn't. I was here all night. No, you came in for 10 minutes, but we have to pay you for 2 hours. So having been there all night and the next day, I made 30 hours, 32 hours worth of pay in one day. And so it was just, like I said, a great job for a college kid. I could actually survive all year at college.
Interesting. All right. Well, is there anything else that we didn't talk about that we covered last night? Well, why don't you tell some of the cities in Iowa that you got sent to? We were talking about that last night.
Well, in Iowa, I actually started, I worked in Dunkerton, Iowa. I worked in Aurora, in Stanley, Iowa. I actually worked in Owine, Iowa. But then I worked, and I worked in Emmitsburg and,
Okoboji out that way.
yeah, but not Okoboji was the name of the town. I told you.
Spencer?
Spencer. I was headquartered in Spencer, worked in Emmitsburg and out there. And it's funny because when I was out there, the biggest carloads of goods that came in and out of Spencer were to the Budweiser Distribution Center in Spencer, Iowa at the time. When I worked at the other ones in Iowa, the one was at the headquarters in Owine, and I did teletype on the night shift. And so back in the day, the best we could do was you would type out a teletype, and then you would put it in the teletype machine, and it would send it to Kansas City or Omaha or Minneapolis or Chicago. And that was when it was always just punching those little holes that looked like Braille. And then when you'd load them up, they'd just go, and then it'd come out and punch it out at the other end. And then they'd have to run it through their machine, and it would their typewriter machine would type it all out for them. So that was the spiffy technology of the 1970s. You might see it in some really old movies. And then when I was working in Minnesota, I would work in places like Stillwater, Minnesota. I worked in St. Peter, Minnesota, where they had a silica sand mine, and most of that sand would go to be made into glass. I worked in Cannon Falls, Minnesota, where they took barley and actually changed the barley sugars into malt. And they would sprout the barley and then heat it up, and then that would kill the growth. But the sugars had been converted into malt, and then that malted barley was all shipped to Tennessee to Jack Daniels. So those were kind of fun little activities that we would do. Like I said, when I worked in St. Charles, Illinois, it was, there was like 15 different companies, but the big ones were the ones making Pillsbury and Betty Crocker and all of those making, they weren't pancake mixes mostly. Most of them were being made into cake mixes. So different kinds of cake mix. Down in Missouri, it was just mostly rural farming communities, unless I was in St. Joe, and then that was one of their headquarters. And the old Chicago Northwestern building down in St. Joe, Missouri is still there, and it's in the same part of town that Jesse James's house was where he was killed. They're like 2 blocks apart. So that's another little tidbit that I remember from those days.
So they didn't haul livestock on trains, did they?
No, not by then. Nope.
Okay.
So yeah, so you hear in all these old Western cowboy movies how they loaded the cattle up out in Kansas from here and there, each of those little towns, and then they'd ship it all to Chicago, to the Chicago stockyards. By then, none of that existed, and I don't believe at that time there were any cold storage railroad cars in use. Today you might find some, but a lot of semis they have the cold storage unit on the front, and the semis are kept very cold and stuff's frozen. They call those reefer trucks, and we did not, that I remember, have any of those kind of trucks. So unfortunately, those people in Spencer drank warm beer when they got it.
Did your family ever go on any trips when your grandfather was the depot agent, just because he had that?
My grandmother had a lifetime pass, but
Can you find that picture that you showed earlier with your,
I turned your phone on.
and
what?
tell about that?
Turn my phone off. Yeah, so you turned it off.
Well, because it was buzzing. The train.
But so yeah, my grandmother, because my grandpa was the agent, had a lifetime pass, but the trains quit running. I would say around 1960, based on
The passenger trains.
the passenger
Yeah.
trains.
Yeah.
So her lifetime pass really didn't do her a whole lot of good. But we used to get to ride on the train with her. She would take us to Des Moines to visit the rest of her family, her sisters and her cousins. And but we didn't ever go on any trips like out west or Chicago or any, the most we ever went to was Des Moines. We could have probably rode the passenger train to Minneapolis, where we would have had relatives, but no, that was all we ever did. And
So what Doug is looking for is a photo that we already have in the museum, but we didn't know who was in it. And now we're going to know,
maybe
if you can find it.
we just had it.
Yeah.
So where did it get to? Here. So, yeah, at one point my grandmother and my aunt Annetta Nye Moeller took my two cousins, Tom and Philip Moeller, and my two sisters, Laura and Lela Smith, and my little brother, Larry Smith. They took them all on a trip to Des Moines because my grandmother wanted them all to have the opportunity to ride on a train at the time they were going to quit. And so my little brother, Larry, and the picture's not dated, at least, oh yeah, circa 1960. So that would have been about when the railroad stopped running passenger through Dunkerton and all of those cities and towns.
So Larry was probably about 4. Right?
So he's pretty little. But because there were 5 of them, they didn't trust Grandma to take them by herself.
Yeah.
So.
That's awesome.
In 60, he was probably only 3.
Well, this
Is he
says
57 or 56? Oh,
so,
57 probably, yeah. Yeah, so there's probably only 3.
but they're so it was interesting, and there are another 2 people that I don't recognize in the photo, so I don't think you'll know who those 2 are.
So we've got another quick little topic. Your mother had a very important job in Dunkerton for many years. You want to talk about?
Yeah, so at
And this
one
would be Edie Smith,
Edie Nye
Nye.
Smith Adams worked for the Dunkerton Telephone Company for I don't know exactly how long, but she started working when I was a young child, so that would have been in the 50s. And then the Dunkerton Telephone Company was managed by an operator on duty. So you had to ring the operator, tell him what number you wanted or who you wanted to talk to, and then the operator would connect you to that party line, because everyone was on a party line, and execute the appropriate ring for that line, and then your party would hook up and the operator would drop off, you hoped, and not listen in on your conversation. But
And we're talking about an actual physical connection,
a
right?
physical, yeah, pick up a wire from your line and connect it to a wire on whatever other line, party line that was going out. So a lot of the party lines had 4 or 5 houses connected to them, and your ring might have been 2 longs and a short. That was the one we had as kids. And so you would have to listen to that, and the only people you could talk to were the people that were in the Dunkerton Telephone District without it being considered a long distance call. Dewar was a long distance call, Jessup was a long distance call, Fairbank was long distance, Reedland was long distance, so nothing like today when you can just pick up your phone and talk to somebody in Anchorage, Alaska, face to face. And then she worked there for the rest of her career, and she worked through the transition from when they went to the old-fashioned wall phone that you held the handle and talked into the microphone. Everybody got either a wall or a tabletop phone that had a little ringer on it. She worked through that. She worked through the time where everybody got the ring or the circular dial phones, and you could actually start to call people. By then, when you could actually call people by the dial phone, you no longer had to communicate with the operator. So she became part of the business managing, and then all of the people's bill was probably calculated and administered by her every month, right up until the time that she retired, which would have been, I don't know either.
Yeah. Larry knows.
Larry knows,
Because
yes.
Larry's got the telephone.
Yes, Larry's got the phone.
So the wooden wall telephones, was that what most people probably had in their homes? Or?
Originally, yes.
Okay, but the
Yep.
tabletop ones were an option also?
No, not at
Everybody
first.
had-
Everybody had the old wall phone
Longs.
that you saw where the speaker was in the box, and then you
little-
picked the little hand dial up to put to your ear. And so those finally got moved out, and you either got a wall phone or a desk phone, but it had a little round dial that you would dial, or
Rotary, it's called.
rotary that you would ring the operator. Well, then those finally phased out to the dial with the where you dial the number, the chink,
Yep.
chink, chink. Yep, you'd have to go through the number sequence. So she lived through that whole transition from the original old through the modern era. Margie Rackamer actually lived in the building, her and I believe her husband, and I don't know his name, but they actually lived in the building where the phone office was, and
And the
they
phone
would have to
office-
get up in the middle of the night to connect you if somebody called. So I don't know, no one ever told me you couldn't call after a certain time at night, but I'm assuming there was some kind of etiquette that you didn't call after a certain hour unless it was an emergency, in those first early days of the telephone.
Because you'd have to get them out of
Yeah.
bed.
Yeah, because they, if you wanted to talk to somebody at 2:00 in the morning, it probably needed to be important to wake them up to do that. So they'd have to get up and come out and hook you up. So
So the telephone office was on Main Street?
on Main
Was
Street,
it the little brick building on the north side?
it was a little brick building on the north side originally,
Okay.
and then they eventually built the newer brick building on the north side of Main Street, halfway between McMillan's grocery store and what was Knievel's. And that building's still there today. I don't know what they use it for now, but
Well, it had
Is
been
it
the
still-
library. It was a doctor's office for a while.
okay.
It was
So
the
I don't know
library.
where is your phone company headquarters?
Up on the hill.
It's on the hill now
Yep.
too?
Yep.
So yeah, so all of that was fun. And my brother does, or my nephew, one of them has the telephone that was given to my mom when she retired. That was the original old-fashioned phone. And my brother, who lives in Alaska, Larry Smith, has Tom Nye's actual telegraph key set up that he used as an operator for the railroad. And I have his actual railroad watch. It's just an old-fashioned Elgin railroad watch, but you can't tell that's what it was because it's not labeled with the railroad name or anything. But yeah, so because you had to report every time the train went by, what time it went by your site, and all the railroad guys had the same watch, and somehow they sync the time up every day. So yeah, we did. There was a lot of fun little things that were part of that.
Okay. Well, we're nearing an hour.
Oh geez,
So I think
is that enough?
that's good. So thank you, Doug.
You're welcome.
And hope everybody learns some new history about Dunkerton.
But